Hey everyone, welcome back. Boyle Lewis and Roger Chafian here for the episode 6 Masters of the Air recap. How are you doing, Boyle?
I'm doing fantastic, Roger. Thanks for having me back again.
Oh, appreciate you being here. All right, we're going to just jump right into things. Life is very busy, and this episode, for one with not a lot of action, was pretty packed with things to talk about. So
Yes.
let's get right to it. Let's just sort of recap for everyone what happened in general, and I'm not going to do it chronologically. I'll do it topically because they bounced around a little bit for better storytelling, and then we'll talk about our thoughts on these different
Sure.
areas. So Bucky has bailed out in the previous episode, and he's doing some escape and evasion, and we see a little bit of tactics and techniques there, and ultimately is captured, and that leads to several significant events, which are either completely factual or narrative interpretations of things that actually did happen, and
Hmm.
we'll get to that, and we'll talk about that. We see Rosie, Robert Rosenthal, going on R&R after just 3 missions. But boy, what a 3 missions those were.
That's
And
right.
we'll talk about that, and we'll delve into being flak happy a little bit more than we did previously and how that worked. And then, of course, we got Crosby is at the Oxford conference, and we get some good interplay with our British allies there. And we'll talk about that when we get to it. So, without further ado, let's just jump right in with Bucky.
Okay.
And so, just getting right into it, I really liked the entire sequence of the escape and evasion. There was so much in there as far as, okay, what do I do? What do I have to do? What are my considerations? And there were some moral quandaries for Bucky there as well, right?
There were, absolutely. So we see him, he's escaping, evading. He gets some food, some cabbage or whatever he takes out of a garden. He's going along and he stumbles upon a farmstead and there's some kids. And so there's the moral dilemma. Do I silence these kids and make my way, or do I just tell them to be quiet? And of course, he puts his weapon away, and that kind of leads to his capture is because of that. And that's a common theme that is seen again and again in multiple wars in the future. If anybody's read Bravo 2 Zulu about the SAS group in Desert Storm, and they get
Mm-hmm.
caught, very similar. Kid with a goat comes by. I think Lone Survivor
Mm-hmm.
that kicked off with a very
Marcus
similar
Luttrell.
incident.
Yeah.
So again, this is a common theme when you're escaping and evading, and that moral quandary that you're put in when you come across the local population.
Yeah. I remember when we were doing our train up before going to Iraq, some of my guys were like, all right, if we're separated and we're doing E&E, they looked at me because, of course, as the OIC, you'd get more of the JAG briefings and everything. And they're like, well, are we morally justified in stealing a car if we had to? And I said, yeah. Yeah, I think you're morally justified in stealing a car. And they said, well, what if the guy doesn't want to give it to us? Can we shoot him? And no.
Yeah.
So there's sort of you got to figure out where that line is for your survival. And I know for me, the guys would look at me and go, well, why is that? And I agree or disagree. I went, well, because we're the good guys, right?
That's
We
right.
don't do that.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly right.
So
And as watching it, it brought up a question in my mind about what kind of survival E&E training did they even get?
right,
These guys. I mean, they didn't get any parachute training. I mean, zero. Not
right.
even how to do a PLF, a parachute landing fall.
Hmm.
So they didn't even get that. So I imagine it was pretty rudimentary. Here's your blood shit. Here's your 45. Here's some
Yep.
rounds, and good luck to you.
Right.
Don't get captured.
So explain to the listener what a blood shit is.
So a blood shit is typically sewn into the inside lining of your flight jacket or your flight equipment. Now they issue it to you. It's a
Hmm.
kind of a single square, maybe 8.5 by 11, like about the size of a piece of paper. And on it, it has in the languages that you'll come across in the area that you're fighting. And it basically says, I'm an American, I'm in distress, I've found myself in your country, and if you help me, my country will reward you. And on the corners are these perforated edges with serial numbers on there. And you could tear it or cut it off, and you hand it to the people who help you, and then they can go later turn that in to an embassy, and they get it. A monetary reward
Hmm.
is what they end up getting. Um, and it's called a blood ship because you're making this bond in blood with them, and they're made of silk because it doesn't matter if it gets wet, how hot it is, how dry, that material is still going to last with that. And they are still issued out to this day, and that language changes depending on where you happen to be
Your
flying.
AOR. Yeah, of course. And probably the most famous or well-known example didn't have the corners to tear off, but was the patches on the back of the Flying Tigers jackets
That's right.
back in the day. And I'll admit, I was surprised, not being an aviator, when I transitioned careers into expeditionary warfare, and we started doing all that. We won't even get into the whole, ISO prep, because I think a lot of the process is still classified. But suffice it to say, there's all these things you do ahead of time to make sure that rescue forces know it's you and not a trap. But yeah, I was surprised when they said, and by the way, here's what you fill out and you get your blood shit. So that was interesting that we still do that. I do think you're absolutely right. They did not get E&E or SEER training the way we think about it today. They did have all these little things, but I think it was not nearly as universal and widespread, like little compasses that might be in a button, or little tiny silk maps that could be sewn into linings of things, and so on and so forth. The other thing that I think is probably a lot different from today is how many of these guys came from rural backgrounds. So me, growing up literally in the city of San Francisco, if I jumped out of a B-17 in the middle of nowhere, I'd be just as likely to eat something poisonous and probably kill myself. But I'm thinking these guys probably had a little more background on at least how to survive in the wild. But to your point, no formal training.
Yeah, no. In Don Miller's book, he chronicles a couple folks who escape and evade successfully, and these are the ones who grew up in rural backgrounds. Who had to hunt and fish. You think about the Great Depression. They were putting meat on the table, and so they knew how to hide in the woods, how to be stealthy, what kind of food to go after, what kind not to.
And then we see very early when the boys that Bucky sees and decides not to shoot alert their families, the two fathers, the father and the uncle, whomever they are, come after him. Such a difference from, for obvious reasons, the Dutch family, right, that we saw earlier. But this is really understandable. I think a lot of people are like, oh, the evil Germans, and oh, the good Dutch. Well, I mean, we'll talk about this a little bit later when we get to the city, but when you think about the relative positions, this makes a lot of sense.
It absolutely does, and it's the sentiment. It is Germany. It is their country. From their perspective, they are at war. The Americans are attacking them along with the British, and so of course they see a downed airman, and they're going to capture that person and turn him over to the authorities.
Absolutely, just like the British would in with the Home Guard, and everyone's probably seen the pictures of the Home Guard, the old men and the young boys, and the pitchforks and the downed German bombers. But then things take a little bit of a darker turn as Bucky's handed over, and it's not really clear. They don't make it really clear in the episode who he's initially turned over to. So there's what happened to Bucky actually, and then there's this constructive narrative that they use to tell a story of something that actually happened but not to Bucky. So do you want to just briefly describe what actually happened to Bucky in that interim period before or between his initial capture and being handed over to the Luftwaffe camp? And we'll of course talk about that camp later tonight and more, I'm sure, in future episodes.
That's right. So Bucky, what really happens to him, he escapes and evades for a few days and is captured, I think pretty much as depicted, and then turned over to the first people he's turned over is to the Luftwaffe police, and they were the folks charged with specifically taking charge of downed airmen that were captured, by the local population or kind of the Home Guard. And this was put in place by this point by Hermann Goering himself, because he wanted to ensure good treatment of downed airmen so that it would be reciprocated in kind in England because of incidents like the one that we'll talk about here in a second. So that was a pretty well established handoff to the Luftwaffe police. Then they would take you to the intermittent Stalag for interrogation, and then off you go to a bigger camp.
Right. And what we see in the episode is a interpretive retelling of something that's become known as the Russelheim Massacre. And that really gave me pause when I stepped back and I thought about that. I said, a massacre? Well, in the end, it was 6 guys, I think, in the real case, not the 4 or 5 we saw here. And I first thought, well, massacre, that's sort of a strong term. And then I had to take a step back and go, well, that's just the level of barbarity that we're talking about in World War II, that 5 or 6 guys being killed now as POWs would be considered a massacre.
That's
but
right.
We sort of get numb to it when we talk about World War II. But as you saw in the series, it's the same concept. There was a B-24 crew, and we'll put the picture up here, a B-24 named Wham Bam Thank You Ma'am, from a popular song, and actually Bugs Bunny, as you see here, was their nose art. They were shot down, and what you saw happen there happened to 6 of their crew members pretty accurately, as far as being marched through the town. And the uniforms were a little different. They looked like they might have been some sort of home guard, not the Luftwaffe police, but it was the Luftwaffe that had captured them. And then as they marched them through the town of Russelheim, the day after they were captured, it was just really bad timing, because they had not bombed Russelheim, but Russelheim was the target of an RAF attack that night. And so the people you see portrayed there, working through the rubble, working through the wreckage, they have just been bombed. This is not a day old. This is not a week old. This is hours old damage. And now here are these Allied flyers, and emotion takes over. And it just, a scenario plays out exactly like you see it there. There really was two, I believe, of those crew members escaped because the Nazi guard ran out of ammunition. Another one really did escape off the back of the wagon as they were transporting them to bury the bodies. And in fact, there was a member of that crew who was named Staff Sergeant Brennenstuhl, who was badly wounded in the aircraft or in the bailout and landed separate from the rest of the crew. And a German farm family took him in, treated him, turned him over to the Luftwaffe police, I believe, and he survived it. He's why we know most of this story. I thought that was an important contrast to bring out.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And you're exactly right, Roger. This is depicted pretty much as is, although this did not happen to Bucky. This happened in August of 43. We are in our narrative, we're in October of 43 when Bucky is shot down. And just as you say, they and that was, I think it was the Luftwaffe police. They get him off the train. The crowd is incensed. Their town has just been blown up. They're pulling people out of the rubble. They're very, very angry, and then they start attacking. And yes, it was kind of a local guardsman who's the one who lines them up and just starts shooting them, one at a time. They get beaten, and then absolutely right. I think there were actually 2 people who escaped off of a bloody cart as depicted with Bucky, and then were captured later and then thrown in a Stalag. But you're right about the other crew member who was picked up by a German family and was not part of this, thankfully.
Right. And there was one little tiny bit of this scene that I thought they did intentionally, and they juxtaposed it with, I believe it was episode 4. We see a German mother lifting her child, her dead child, out of the rubble. And I thought it served to just connect the humanity on both sides of these, which is so important. It's so easy to vilify the other side in a war and forget that they're human too.
Exactly. And especially with this character of Bucky, as we saw in episode 4, he's walking down the street. He sees the London mother pulling her child out of the rubble. And that's when he makes the phone call back to base. And so he's like, oh my gosh, the darn Nazis killed this kid. He finds out his best friend has just been shot down. He's incensed. We saw in the previous episode, he's like, hey, this is war. We really got to make it as bad as we can. Otherwise, this is going to go on forever till we're all killed. And now he sees, oh, this is what it looks like on this side.
Right. And that's something I think is I've read from aviators, it's you fight it at such a distance, you don't see the effects.
That's
And
right.
here he is face to face with the effects of that. I think it's a very humanizing moment, and
Yeah.
again, just really important to connect, because without going off on a soliloquy here, you have to find a way to the peace at some point,
Yes.
right? And I know it can take a generation or two. We pretty much managed to mend our fences with the Germans relatively quickly, but most veterans of the Pacific War, for example, uh, went to their graves unable to forgive the Japanese. And yeah, go ahead.
That's true. And that was for whatever reason, it was just another level of brutality, whether it was the environment, whether it was the types of tactics that were used. But you're exactly right. It seemed that in Europe, although we mended fences in Japan
We did. Yeah.
pretty quickly afterwards, during the occupation and then subsequently after. But you're exactly right. There are many, many veterans of the Pacific Campaign who just went to their grave, not an ounce of forgiveness
Right.
in there.
And I have to admit, I'm not exactly sure how well I would get along with an Al Qaeda or a Taliban or ISIS fighter at this point, right? It may take a generation. I don't know. Discussion for another day.
That's right.
But so Bucky is, as you said, recaptured. And he's recaptured by, they appear to be, to me in the episode, to be German police, actually civilian police who had very ornate uniforms like those. And he's taken to an intermediate camp. And we have a couple things going on in the whole process of transporting him. So that transport, there's the very poignant scene of the two trains, right? The train that the POWs are being loaded onto, and then the other train. And this is the first indicator, like, use a different word. This is the first time the Holocaust is referenced in the Masters of the Air series. But I think importantly, it's a visual indicator of the first time that U.S. soldiers, airmen, really started to realize how bad the things over there were going in that regard.
That's exactly right. And everyone knew that there were atrocities being, a program against the Jews, and that had started during the interwar period. And so that was not a new thing, but nobody could really conceptualize or had any inkling just how bad it had gotten. And to be able to see that for yourself, or even if they had heard, it was almost unbelievable to kind of hear that and think, no, even though the Nazis are bad, surely it can't be that depraved. And to see it with your own eyes. And Don Miller does a good job in his book about different incidents, just like the one we saw in the episode, others where they're being marched along and they're passing a group of Jews who are heading in another direction, and just the absolute depravity of these people and the brutality that was being put upon them, and just the gut-wrenching helplessness that those downed airmen felt about that they can do nothing about it. Here they're seeing the absolute worst in humanity, and they are powerless to stop it.
Absolutely. And then after that, we have the shift, which I think is intentional in a jarring way, to the interrogation scene. And this is very different from the resistance interrogating, right, to make sure you are who you say you are. We have the Luftwaffe captain, perhaps, I think he was a captain, interrogating Bucky. And there were a couple nuances here that I found really interesting, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, because you've been through the full SEER course, Camp Slappy, right? As I've
That's
heard
right.
it called. I've got the light version, if you will.
Yeah, so you read different histories about World War II and downed airmen and their capture, and they're pretty consistent, even from German records and German interviews after the war, that they knew that torture isn't going to get you much. It's much better to anybody's going to break under torture, and they'll tell you anything you want to hear at some point. And so they found it was much, much better, especially for folks who are maybe a little more naive. They're very rural. They're very scared. They just jumped out of this burning wreckage of an airplane, and to have somebody who's kind of being friendly, here's a cigarette, have have a glass of whiskey. Hey, we're both professionals here, and to build that rapport, plus just the volume of information that they were able to collect from open source, from newspapers, from radios, from other prisoners, and they could quickly build a dossier on just about anybody that they needed. You know, people are wearing their patches. They can quickly put together, you know, quite a lot of information about somebody. And you think already from reading different accounts and memoirs and whatnot, when you're on the other side of the table and they're like, "Oh, Scott Chafin, we know who you are. We know you live in Virginia Beach. You know all this stuff, and we know you went to this school. We already know this. You're not going to tell us anything new." And then they just start having a conversation, and sure enough, they're able to pull other things out of you that you didn't even mean to tell them, and maybe you're not even aware that you're giving away anything.
Exactly, and that's how they know some of the things that they're throwing at Bucky, right? They're asking about Buck, and they're talking about where they're from and when are the planes coming in and the replacement planes and so on and so forth. And then they go to work on sort of the insidious little things, like you said, hey, we're both professionals here, but you know, those Gestapo guys.
That's right.
Yeah. You know, talk to me. I can protect you. Talk to me. And it's, you know, it becomes very compelling, and you have to remember that, you know, as we watch this, these guys are in their mid-20s, their late 20s. A lot of them have never been out of the country before. To your point, you know, 2 or 3 days before their plane is on fire and they had to jump out of it for the first time they've ever been in a parachute. They've been eating cabbage and running from the German army and Luftwaffe, and now they're here. It all starts to wear you down, and to your point, that little bit of kindness and just, you know, slipping up. We've all seen it, right? Like a really good salesperson doesn't try and sell you anything but themselves.
That's exactly right. Yep.
Yeah. And once that's complete, and Rosie sort of sticks to his guns. Bucky sticks to his guns, name, rank, serial number.
Mm-hmm.
He's then transported to Stalag Luft 3. And if you know, you know. And if you don't, I think we'll save that, because I have to imagine it's going to be mentioned in a future episode.
I think it will be as well. And I started to make all kinds of notes about Stalag Luft 3, and I thought, nah, I think we're going to wait.
We'll hold off. But he does get reunited with Buck.
Yes.
Right? And so how accurate was that scene when they're reunited?
That was spot on accurate. You read any memoir of a POW from the Second World War, airman, you read Don Miller's book, any history, and as the new folks are being brought in, everybody rushes to the entrance to look and see who do they know. And it's almost like a homecoming for some folks, and people who you thought were dead, there they are. And it's a real big, although awful circumstances, a joyous time. I don't even know if I could even say that, but you know, they're very happy to see one another like that. And then specifically between Buck and Bucky, with Buck saying, "What took you so long?" is word for word exactly what he said and where he said it. He was on one side, and there goes Bucky and catches his attention, and that is exactly how that happened.
Yeah. And remember that this is late 1943. The war is still sort of in the balance. We're at the tipping point of the war by the fall of 1943. In hindsight, you can say, yes, this Germany will never be on the strategic offensive again. They'll have one or two operational offensives. They have multiple tactical offensives. They're the masters of the counterattack. But at the time, we don't know that. You don't know that when you're in the war. And why do I bring that up? Because being sent to this prisoner of war camp is one of the best outcomes you can have if you're captured in the war at this point. Because the Luftwaffe was notoriously less harsh, if not kind, to the internees of the RAF and the USAF.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And certainly, you know, from the 8th Air Force perspective, the rate of attrition, in your mind isn't, oh yeah, this thing is inevitable, we're going to win. I mean, you were losing people left and right all the time, and certainly, imminent victory is not the forefront of every conversation that's happening with folks.
Right. We are still 8 or 9 months from D-Day, and it's worth remembering that while Eisenhower's magnificent statement on the soldiers, sailors, and airmen on the Great Crusade, he had another one in his pocket, taking responsibility when the landings failed, just in case.
Exactly right.
So, yeah, not a done deal at all. But we'll let Stalag Luft 3 be. There's a lot more to come there, and we'll talk. I'm
Yes,
sure we will talk about that. If only because the previews told me we will, but I can't see how they wouldn't, right?
That's right.
So let's jump over to Rosie,
Okay.
who is going on to R&R, as I said, after only 3 missions. But man, your first 3 flights, you're the lone survivor of the squadron after that last flight, and you need a break. And your squadron leader and your group leader realize you need a break. So off they send them, almost to this, I don't want to say Neverland, but this, it's so jarring, right? It's wow, it's the English countryside, and everyone's in civilian clothes, and there's pretty girls on bikes, and they're waving at me, and everyone knows my name, and what a contrast.
Absolutely. And that was portrayed exceptionally well. There were, landed gentry in England who did that, who donated their homes to the war effort for whatever happened to be, whether it was going to be a headquarters or a rest and relaxation area for folks. And they purposely, no uniforms, first names only, no rank. They had a lot of the Red Cross volunteer ladies who were there as well, again, to make it more welcoming, to make it a little softer while they were there.
And the woman who meets them, like, she must have had a dossier on all of them, because she's calling them by their first name. She knows so much about them, just to sort of put them at ease, because whether it's just these 3 horrible missions, or you've been going for a dozen missions, or what have you, the PTSD is starting to build, even though they didn't call it that at that point. And we can see that in Rosie, first through his denial, like, I don't need to be here. What was that like for him? Miller obviously will recount more than the series is able to because of the medium.
Yeah, so I think for Rosie, he was probably pretty genuine, although certainly felt stressed, and you could see, and I think the actor's done a really good job of that, like, oh my gosh, this is pretty shocking, the times we've seen him getting out of an airplane, and it's very, very hard emotionally, physically, spiritually for him to be able to carry that kind of burden. But I honestly think Rosie's portrayal is, this is what a military professional is thinking about. And although he, after December 7th, he was one of the people who ran down to the recruiting station and signed up out in New York. The others who volunteered just thought of it as hey, this is a job, and it's a job I need to do, but it's very, very stressful. Rosie was like, I want to master this profession. And in order to do this job, I need to do it well. I'm going to be the best possible person at this. And getting out of the rhythm of it, although awful and stressful, is going to make me not as good as I could possibly be. I don't need to take a knee. What I need is to get back in an airplane, whether it be on a real mission or keep training. And I think his feeling was pretty genuine about that. Clearly, it's not going to hurt taking a few days off, but he really didn't want to be there. He really wanted to be back at the group, training and honing his craft. And one thing that we've seen that I think we'll see how it's portrayed in the rest of the series, but with the 100th Bomb Group, there's been a trend. They're always out of position. They're always too far back. They can never catch up. And that is because, although they had a lot of spirit with Buck and Bucky, they didn't have the professional discipline that the other bomb groups had. And not saying that led to their high attrition rate, but I think it's something that Rosie notices, especially in the previous episode with we're so far back, look how far out of position we are. And he realizes that because of that lack of professionalism, that lack of aerial discipline, that their group was put in a position where they became the obvious target. And
Right.
had he been up there with the rest of them, things may have been different. And he's
Right.
going to go back now with a renewed sense of let's really hone our craft here and become as good as we can possibly be. But being at the R&R home is not where he wants to be. That's not his vision of how to win this war.
Right. A couple things that jumped out at me from what you just said. One is, from what I've read, exactly what you said. The 100th just didn't quite have that same discipline. And that's not a slight. I mean, you have to realize these guys went from being civilians to, I know sometimes it would take a year, 18 months to get overseas, sometimes a lot less. Like, these are not career professional military men. They are thrust into this. It's something that nowadays takes, 3 months if you do it dedicated at OCS, 4 years if you do it through a service academy or ROTC. And that's just sort of get the basics of how are you going to be an officer, and then another probably 18 months to 2 years to be a pilot,
at least
without learning your aircraft type, your tactical aircraft type.
Yeah.
So literally, if you drop a modern template onto the Second World War, if you signed up for, say, the Naval Academy or ROTC or the Air Force Academy, right? In your case,
Woo!
the war would be over before you got commissioned through flight school and through the RAG and FRS. So not a slight on these guys at all.
No, not at all. But I think it's something that Rosie notices.
Absolutely. I have a question for you. When you deployed as an aviator, when you came out of theater, I guess you would have been on the carrier for your air wing deployment, and then you did expeditionary deployments, or were you all air wing?
No, so do 2 air wing and then 1 expeditionary out of Kuwait during OIF for the kickoff of that in 03, and then a ground tour with 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines.
Okay, so when you came out with the ground tour, did they make you go through Kuwait and sit in Kuwait for like 4 or 5 days before they let you go home?
They made us sit in Kuwait for, I think it was about 2.5, but that was, to my recollection, that was not for any kind of decompression. It was for, we're just waiting for the airplane. And that just,
Okay.
The replacement, the unit that we were doing the turnover with, that's just how it kind of worked out. But I do remember being annoyed that I was there in Kuwait. We just come out of very intense 9 months of counterinsurgency, very, very hot and unpleasant. And then to be there suddenly where there's like salsa night. And you're like, what
is going on?
What is going on? The
Yeah.
Brit, contrasted with the Brits, and I don't know when they started it in OIF and OEF, but when their troops would rotate home, they would go through Cyprus intentionally, and they would go there for a week. And it was drink your face off, all kinds of physical activity, but it was designed to burn some of that tension and steam off of you so that your first night back, unlike us, we got on an airplane and then, next thing I know, I'm back in Camp Lejeune. We did stop in Shannon, Ireland, though, and drank as much Guinness as we could possibly consume in about 45 minutes at 8 in the morning. So God bless the Shannon, Ireland airport.
Oh, see, you got the e-ticket ride, because I ended up there for 4 or 5 days with my battalion and had to take 2 flights. And they did tell us, they're like, yeah, we're learning that people need to decompress a little bit. But to your point, it was so jarring. And I was, as I've said before, about 60% FOBIT, so not nearly what you were doing, but just the jarring difference of not worried about the indirect fire, not worried about going on convoys, getting on a flight, going outside the wire. And the pace was so slow. I can only imagine if you threw on top of that suddenly, an English manner.
Yeah.
right? And the girls on the bicycles and the music and the let's go boating, and it just would have been so jarring. I can understand knowing you have to go back for Rosie. You don't want to lose that edge.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And I think at least they portrayed it really nicely, because when they cut back to him, actually, I want to come back to that in a minute. I want to mention something that, to your point of Rosie being the professional, I feel like he really took seriously the idea of being the aircraft commander and looking out
Yes,
for his crew.
that's exactly right.
They talked about how him just humming or whistling that tune, singing that song, it just recentered everybody. And you hear stories you've probably experienced with people who are just that guy in combat, who will be like, well, now's the time to crack a joke, or now's the time to say something just sort of, off or just shocking or something, to just let everyone know, hey, it's going to be okay. Let's not let the fear take over. And so I just want to acknowledge that trait in him.
Yeah,
yeah.
A great leader. And we talked about it last time, and then it's brought up in this episode, that incident. It's being talked about in kind of a legendary status. When he's not even there, they're talking about this event and how it, although bizarre, and they're busting his chops about it.
Yeah,
that
and
how
it becomes legendary.
It becomes legendary.
Yeah, but then what I really appreciated was he's back at Thorpe's Abbot. And we don't know about the mission. We don't know what's going on. He has to climb back into the fort, right? The B-17. It's so hard for him to do it. It's so hard to muster that. And I felt that. I felt that, man, he lost that edge. He's like, he's got to put all that emotional armor back on and steel himself to do this yet again. So I liked how they played that out.
I did too, and I really liked how he's drumming his fingers on the side of the hatch, and then you can hear the music of the drummer who he mentioned. Whose name I can't remember, but apparently a very famous 1940s drummer.
Right.
He said,
We're
"Hey,
not that old, guys."
Yeah, you don't stop him when he's in the middle of a drum solo, and then say, "Hey, come back in 2 weeks and pick it up again." And that was him getting back in the groove, like, okay, I'm picking up the drum solo again. I'm picking it back up. I'm going to lead this crew, and then you could see him. You could see the actor did a good job. Like you said, he couldn't do it. Like, he's got to put the armor back on. He does the drum, and in his mind, that's the click, and he pops himself back up in there.
Yeah. So, really like that bit, and that's the second of our 3 acts, if you will, even though, as I said, they interspersed them, I thought, very nicely. And then we've got Crosby, who I think is just, he's got to be a series favorite at this point, right? Because for me, you start out with Buck and Bucky and these larger-than-life dudes, and Crosby is such an everyman. But he's just clearly so good at what he does, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
like I sort of go, oh, Buck and Bucky, larger than life leaders. Oh, I could be Crosby though. I could probably puke in my helmet and mistakenly send us to France. I could do that, So, everyone's sort of in his corner, and he gets sent to this conference. And in the series, at least, they don't explain to us what this conference is. Did they talk about it in the book?
It's not in the book, but he describes it in his book, Winging a Prayer. And it was a conference about how do we bring the Americans and the English closer together, have better cultural understanding for one another. Because there was still, I don't think at the lower levels there was as much tension, but certainly at the higher levels. And if you read any histories about, the Supreme Commanders and the different, larger than life personalities that there was a lot of U.S. versus English tension at the kind of national command and Joint Chiefs level. And it was thought, hey, let's bring officers together, and both English and American, and then we'll give them, hey, here's kind of background on English history. Here's background on European history. Here's what our culture is like, to try and help diffuse some of those tensions that were there at the higher levels. And then Crosby gets kind of thrown into this. And then just narrative wise, though, again, in the series, we're in October of 43. In reality, this conference wasn't until February of 44 is when he goes. But it's fine. It's an artistic choice to be able to show, as you said, the three different acts that are happening simultaneously here.
Right. Like what's going on out of the air, or not in the air. And it was interesting because, of course, we now heard the Brit saying the line, what's the problem with Yanks? They're overpaid, oversexed, and over here. And I don't remember Rosie's retort about the Brits, but then he goes on to mention, and by the way, these guys are cutting loose because they may not be here tomorrow.
That's right.
Which there's a lot of sort of interesting history there because, of course, the fighter pilots for the RAF are sort of the darlings of Britain, right? They're the saviors of the realm. Never in the history of human events has so many owed so much to so few. My apologies to the ghost of Winston Churchill. I probably got that wrong. But the RAF bomber crews are not the darlings. Definitely not after the war. Probably not even at this point in the war, right? Because there's this knowledge that they're over there bombing German cities the same way that the English cities had been being bombed. So people didn't really talk about that aspect of it. So I think for the Americans to be there, it really was something that had to be stated to that British officer. Well, this is not staff work. This is not, the Royal Navy. Okay, they're in port for a while. They're going to, like, every single day could be the day they go on a mission and just don't come back.
That's right. And I think, there's some of the cultural difference right there between them, between the British stiff upper lip and teach your men some manners, along with I don't care what they do, they could die tomorrow, and that's just how we're going to play this, and also probably a bit of tension with the RAF has been at this for a number of years. They're probably a bit worn down. Then here come the Americans with their shiny clothes, their brand new aircraft. They get paid more. They're generally healthier. They didn't have the the loss of generation from the First World War.
That's right.
We're big and loud and friendly and, gregarious and very, and that's going to cause a clash as well.
Right. And if you look at the English experience with allies up to this point in the war, the numbers were not the same, right? I think the Poles are the most prolific
I think so.
Non-British RAF or non-Commonwealth RAF pilots, not to take away from the Canadians, the Australians, so on and so forth. But in terms of numbers, and the Poles can't hold a candle to how many Americans are there, and the Czechs can't hold a candle to how many Americans are there. Purely in numbers, in terms of pound per pound impact, some of the best pilots out there, not taking anything away from that. But they tended to be a little more quiet, right? So the Brits are not used to their allies coming over, and I mean, let's be honest, we see it even today, right? You get the port brief to not try and be too American, and inevitably a third of the ship is rolling off with big rodeo belt buckles and a Western shirt and a Stetson, right? And it's just
that's right.
It is what it is, right?
It is what it is. You can't change who you are. That's just who you are. Yeah,
exactly. And for the Brits, now I imagine the rooming situation was a bit of artistry, or was it actually true?
This is actually true, and he
talk us through meeting Sandra and who Sandra really was.
Yeah, so as depicted, he knows he's going to have a roommate. They're going to have an adjoining head, basically, or restroom, or shower and sink and toilet between the two rooms, and he's there for a few days alone, and then he goes back one night. Different than depicted how they first met, although I really liked how it was in the show. And then he goes back and is like, oh my gosh, it's a woman. It was totally unprepared for that. And Sandra was actually a real person who was Landra Wainwright, who Crosby writes about in his book. And I'm not sure why they changed the name. Maybe the family didn't want the real name used. Who knows?
Yeah.
But the relationship was pretty much as depicted for what we saw this time, kind of went down according to Crosby, that this is exactly how it went down. They hung out, they shared whiskey, and then got a phone call, and she had to leave,
Right.
pretty quickly.
Yeah. So the one thing to bring up there is she was not brought up in Masters of the Air, correct? But she was brought up in Crosby's own memoirs.
That's exactly right. Yes.
Right. And the other thing is there's a lot of conjecture as to what Landra or Sandra's job actually was. And you and I were having this conversation before we started recording, and I think your thought is probably based more in logic, and mine is based more in a little bit romanticism of jobs, right?
That's
so
right.
so what is your theory based on what you saw?
So my theory was, when she gets the message and has to depart immediately, and hey, they'll send my bags along later, which means, excuse me, that she's somebody pretty important, I think, or has a very important job. Obviously, to get called away at a moment's notice, and then that somebody's going to take care of her kit and get it to her. And then for me, I thought, I wonder what kind of job she has. Is probably pretty high up, access to sensitive information. But she gave Crosby her number in London and said, hey, if you're ever in London, call me or look me up, and here's my number. And so that made me think, okay, she's in London, which means she probably works in the war rooms, Churchill's war rooms, underneath London, which is where Ultra, the information from Ultra, the cracking of the Enigma, was brought out for intelligence purposes. And they used that to divert convoys across the Atlantic as they got U-boat information, and how they put together their own deception against the Germans, so the Germans wouldn't figure out that they had cracked the Enigma machine. And so my thought was she is probably down there working in that, privy and read into all of that information, which is why she is not saying what she does.
Right. And my thought was related, but I thought she worked at Bletchley Park, which was the intel center where they actually broke the Enigma codes. Well, okay, in all fairness, this goes all the way back to the Poles again, who don't really ever get any of the credit due to them, I think, in World War II. But the Poles essentially do the early work on breaking the Enigma and letting everyone know about this machine. We've got some pictures up here, and the first computers, massive computers that don't look anything like the phones you and I carry every day, that are 1,000 times more powerful.
That's right.
But in the breaking of these codes, Alan Turing and many other scientists who worked to give this information to the Allies, and as you said, the program code name was Ultra, and it wasn't declassified until, I want to say, the 1970s or maybe not even 1980s.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, this was the capital THE most closely guarded secret of the entire war. And Zoe and I were talking about it after the episode, about like, why was she running off? And I was explaining to her about Ultra and saying, like, they didn't declassify it until I think the 70s or the early 80s.
Yeah.
And even Zoe was like, holy cow, like they held on to that long? Like, yes, I mean, that's how big of a deal it was.
Yeah. And that's so in my thought process, what would go into someone being so deceptive? Now, she was clearly playfully deceptive, right? Oh, I studied punting at Cambridge.
That's right.
Rowing of boats. Okay, whatever. And he catches on pretty quick, but clearly she's doing something that is fairly important, that has to do with intelligence, gathering, usage, some other. And then the other thing is she's a subaltern. See, I have the same problem Crosby did, which is a very weird, sort of unique British thing. Right?
It is.
It is a rank that applied only to women in the auxiliary reserves, right?
That's exactly right. It was to give them kind of officer status, but without bringing them in as officers into the military.
Right. And without passing judgment on whether that was right or wrong. It was a different time. But what's interesting to me is that means she is essentially a junior officer. right?
That's
She's not going to be rooming with Crosby if she's not sort of a U.S. Captain in the Marines, Army, Air Force, lieutenant in the Navy level. Which to me, that really brought it home that O3s, lieutenants, captains, we don't have people take care of our bags when we get called away at our TAD, right? She whatever she was doing was fairly important.
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. But there was a scene there at the end that I wanted to talk about and hover on a little bit because I struggled with this scene. It almost became pivotal in my whole rating of the episode. Yeah, well, no, I don't mean struggled with it like didn't like it. I struggled with what I thought about how they did it. And of course, it's the party. And it's the woman singing "Tear the Fascists Down."
Yes.
Right? So do you want to give some background on the song and things you may have taken away from the party? I'll be honest, I was not familiar with the song until this episode, and I had to look it up.
Yeah, I wasn't familiar with the song either, but there were a lot of clues as they go into the party. So they hear this party from the street, they go into it, and it's kind of a college student party at Oxford. And they go in, and then it is clearly the students who live in that room or occupy that common space or that particular college there at Oxford. They are pro-socialist, pro-communist, pro-union, pro kind of power to the people. Mm-hmm. And the song is a very pro-communist, pro-union, pro-socialist song. And it's not that that they are hoping that Joseph Stalin or Mao Zedong are going to take over England, but the thought was in the interwar, especially in the 30s, that socialism is going to be the next logical step in governmental evolution as we distribute wealth, and that was widely an idea that was widely pursued at Oxford and Cambridge. Also, incidentally, not to get off too much a tangent, this is also where the Soviets recruited many of their spies, was from groups like this, and I think at this point in the war, this is seen as this war is caused by capitalism, by the greed of the bourgeoisie, and the people who are suffering are the workers, and so it is the China in the song. I think she's I can't remember the exact words, but it's like great on Stalin and the people. It's the socialists who are going to save the day. And they're the ones who are doing the heavy fighting against the Japanese in the Pacific and then the Germans there in Europe. And so afterwards, it will clearly be, the next logical step is clearly going to be the socialists and the communists take power so we never have this kind of war ever again.
Right. To your point, I want to say that they even mentioned Mao Zedong, but they did not mention I'm blanking on his name, Chiang Kai-shek, right? Which is sort of a very declarative statement there. If you realize that at this point in time, the Chinese communists and the Chinese nationalists have sort of put aside their differences to fight the Japanese, but we're only mentioning one side. And so the song, I looked it up, is actually by Woody Guthrie, who wrote "This Land is Our Land," right? And this is where I struggled with it because, of course, right now in the 21st century, in the 2020s, we are so polarized about these political concepts. And I will freely admit, my first gut reaction was, is this Hollywood putting very literally rose-colored glasses right onto this and trying to sell this? But then I really started to think about it, and I said, well, no, everything you just said, right? Because the lines, there didn't seem to be any line for capitalism in the 1930s, right? It was fascism or socialism, or it was really fascism and everyone else. Like in the Spanish Civil War, you either went and fought with the Republican brigades or on the side of the nationalists. There was no real, capitalism, democracy's the way to go, right? And I think there was this big feeling of, well, capitalism, it means empire, and it's everything that was Western Europe. And to your point, those were the feelings. And you've got this college campus where, as you rightly say, not that party clearly, but Kim Philby and these
Yep.
the Cambridge
Burgess.
firing that
Yep.
come out, yeah, and all these come out of there, and I thought, okay, they're just sort of showing what one of the takes was, because I think that was a pretty popular feeling in England. And in fact, as soon as the war ends, Winston Churchill is sort of kicked out packing as prime minister, and Great Britain elects a near socialist government. So the more I thought about it, I thought, all right, points for historical accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
Where I go up in the air with this, and I don't know if there was such a party mentioned by Crosby in his book or in Masters of the Air. The only thing that ran through my head is, regardless of what Sandra or her real life counterpart, their job really is, clearly they are doing something that has a fairly high security clearance. I found it odd that she would go to this party and then choose to dance with Crosby instead of leaving. And I don't know if that's a difference of the time or not.
I think maybe a difference in the time. I think they're there for a limited amount of time. Why run off? Why waste a perfectly good party? So what that they're singing about yay to Stalin and yay to Mao. It's free booze, and they probably have snacks, and we can dance. And
that's right. What military guy has not done free booze, snacks, music? All right, I'm in.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
but it to the point, there's a whole stream of research on what people knew when, and it's very topical now with Ukraine and the famine in the 1930s with Stalin. But I think it is fair to point out that at this time in 1943, a lot of the evils of communism are not that apparent. So this is not such a stretch as my 21st century knee-jerk first opinion really was, that why are they doing this? This became very plausible to me that they could have been doing this.
And you have to figure, in the years leading up to it is the Great Depression. Certainly felt very acutely in the U.S., but economic depression across all of Europe, which was caused by, many factors for it. But it's easy to sit in a classroom and go, yeah, the evils of capitalism. And then you've got propaganda coming out from Soviet side, and Mao saying the people are going to take charge, and it looks very attractive, and all you see are the successes, and here you are living through the failures of a different type of political ideology. And so very easy, I think, to go, oh yeah, this one is clearly better based off of limited information.
And it's not unfair. With the benefit of hindsight, one could say maybe it's not true, but post World War I Germany did attempt to be a capitalist democracy, and we see what that led to. So yeah, my final thought, I guess, on that is not implausible and not gratuitous, probably well done and thought-provoking, because here we are talking about it.
If I could just wrap up that whole the scene there with, but it made me think, it's happening in England. There are young college students who are espousing this political view, and that's fine. But it reminded me of the Winston Churchill quote, since he was prime minister at the time, which was, if you don't rebel against the system at 18, you have no heart. But if you haven't bought into the system by the time you're 40, you have no brains. So that's what I thought of when I saw all those things that we discussed.
Right.
About this is very interesting, and what an interesting way to kind of bring in this different kind of lens and viewpoint. But I thought of that immediately.
I think that is perfectly on point. So yes, let's use that on the wrap for that scene, or that act, if you will. And so that brings us to closing thoughts, and those are going to be our ratings, right? So we'll just follow the same structure we have before, and I'll go and I'll say I'm going to continue my rating from last episode. This was a solid 4.5 from me. I felt it showed all the things we just talked about. It showed the fear and the moral conundrum of being behind enemy lines, and it showed the dichotomy of, you've been bombing these people, you are killing these people with high explosive bombs. Is it really immoral to think they want to kill you with bricks and pitchforks and so on and so forth. It had an emotional turn with the reuniting of Buck and Bucky that is great because it's true. It's not a melodramatic plot point. We addressed some of the flack happy PTSD topics, and I know that some people online have said, well, it barely scratched the surface. I'll just say now, for any television series, you are going to scratch the surface. The amount of research and reading you would have to do to really understand. Go get the book. Go get the book when you're done with this and really get into it. And then, of course, seeing the British and American interplay of Crosby there at the end, and then getting the little tease of there's other things going on behind the scenes. I was just really happy with the episode. I think it served as another good bridge transition to take us into the, I believe if my count's right, the last 3 episodes.
That's right.
Which I think are really going to transition us from, we're over here slogging it out, bombing, and getting punched in the mouth every single time, to a couple of different threads of thought. So 4.5 from me.
Great. I'm also going to give it a 4.5. Completely agree. I really liked how they stitched the different narrative or acts together. I like how you framed it like that. I really enjoyed the scenes with Bucky, and it it just showed so much. I agree with you about the PTSD aspects. Highly encourage people to go get Don Miller's book. He is not subsidizing this podcast, by the way. This is a free advertisement for Don.
That's right.
But he goes into, a lot of depth and length about this throughout the book, not just kind of one section, but periodically picks up different pieces of how did they deal with the mental trauma that was coming out of the folks in the 8th Air Force. But I like the human connections piece, but I'm very excited for the future episodes. And I really, again, for me, I really liked the character of Rosie, and, somebody who wants to, okay, this is not just a job, this is a profession. And in order to, these are my own words, right? But that's how I see his kind of wheels turning about that. And in order to get really good at it and to do this job really, really well, then we've got to train and be the absolute best that we possibly can be. So I'm excited to see that aspect of it going forward. And then for Zoe, I have to make one correction. I made a mistake before I give her rating for this episode. For the last episode, she and I were talking about it, and she was kind of going back and forth. And then after she saw our episode review, she's like, "What? No, that episode was a 5.0." So the last episode, she gave a 5.0.
Okay, because I think on the air we said 3.5.
Well, like a 4.1, I think, or something like that.
4.1, yeah.
Not a 5.0.
Yeah. Okay, so home run episode for episode 5.
Yes.
Right, which was the Moonster raid.
The Moonster raid. And even as brutal, and she was like, it was stressful. Yeah. And, I don't think she'll mind me saying this, but like she said, she's like, it's really dusty down here in the basement.
Yeah.
She goes, shows don't make me cry. And that that episode made me cry. So for her, very exciting, traumatic, but really hit the emotional punch for her as well. So that was last episode. So sorry.
Right.
So a correction on behalf of Zoe, sweetheart. I'm sorry I got it wrong. Okay, for this episode, it's a 4.7.
Okay.
He really liked the seeing the interchange between Sandra and Crosby about that human connection. Here people put in this horrible circumstance, and like Sandra says, the only reason people are dying is because Hitler and his folks decided they're going to try and do something. And she really liked, though, that human connection between the two of them. And then at the very end, when we see Buck, she was like, she just couldn't believe it. And they did, I knew it was going to happen. I've read the book.
Right.
I knew exactly what he was going to say. And I have to admit, there was a lot of dust in the basement. When that scene happened, I was like,
Yeah, my allergies kicked in that scene too. It was weird. Yeah, I don't
Weird.
know why.
Yeah, it's spring allergies or
Yeah, I think the dog was nestled up with me or
Right.
something at that point. But
Clearly,
yeah,
clearly that's it.
yeah,
So,
right.
but she, I mean, how they put it together and then ending like that, it was. I mean, Zoe was fist pumping.
Yeah,
So again, for her, 4.7.
nice.
Really, really enjoyed it.
Well, I'm excited for the next one. I'm in that bittersweet excitement for the last three, right? Because I want to see it, but it's the end.
That's right.
But for me, that's a good sign because that's a hallmark. That's a hallmark of something really good is that you don't want it to end. And I had said at the beginning, we'll see. I want it to be more than the sum of its parts, and so far we are definitely getting there. I think they have some challenges because we've all seen the previews, and they're going to have to find an organic way to work in some things that were not directly narrative to the 100th Bomb Group. But they've done the time juxtapositions adroitly enough and bringing in this incident with the Russelheim Massacre here well enough that I think they can pull it off.
I think so too. I think so.
All right. So anything else before we go?
No, that's it. Excited for the next episode. Looking forward to seeing you again, Roger.
All right. Sounds good, man. We'll talk to everyone next week.
All right. Bye.